Sword Art Online Moon Cradle is one of those divisive stories of the series, consisting of the two books immediately following the massive Alicization arc, volumes 19 and 20. Moon Cradle is a story of many things, but also of nothing at the same time. A bizarre mishmash of intriguing core concepts, none of which actually reaching a conclusion within the story itself. Let's have a look into the good and the bad of Sword Art Online Moon Cradle. Welcome to Gamerturk's Book Club. Let's start with a very quick overview and I'll dive deeper right after for those interested. Moon Cradle is a 2 volumes long side story taking place during the maximum acceleration phase of the Alicization arc, so during the 200 years. The events occur roughly a year and a half after the ending of War of Underworld in Underworld time, of course. The length of the event is also roughly a single week long, the investigation of a murder mystery that could not have happened due to the existence of the taboo index of the Human Empire, now ruled by the Human Unification Council, and the law of power existing in a dark territory ruled by the highest ranking remaining member of the region, the leader of the Pugilists Guild, Iskahn. The first part of Moon Cradle, that is volume 19, consists of establishing the stage of the story with a little bit of a recap here and there on Alicization content, and then Kirito and Ronye journeying to the Dark Territory to discuss the dire circumstances with Iskahn to prevent a second War of Underworld between the two nations. The second half of the story, featured in volume 20, very much focuses on solving the murder mystery as Kirito, Asuna, Ronye and Tiese investigate the scene of the crime, followed by Ronye and Tiese stumbling upon the perpetrators in the old imperial villa of the Norlangarth Empire belonging to the past Cruiga Norlangarth, who was supposed to have been killed by Ronye herself with the help of Düsseldorf Synthesis 7 and Tiese. However, just when the reanimated Northern Emperor was about to take the lives of Ronye and Tiese, Kirito and Asuna arrive on the scene to destroy the reanimated puppet. While the outer facade of the mystery is thus solved, the intricacies of the reanimated former emperors and their attempt at inciting unrest between the two nations to ignite another war remains unsolved at the end of the story. And looking at the afterword of Reki Kawahara, this unsolved subplot may still be haunting Underworld 200 years later into the future, when Kirito, Asuna and Alice return to Underworld only to find Stika and Lorene ambushed by the Abyssal Horror due to having been fed false information from their colleagues over on the planet Admina about their path being safe. But that's a separate topic and we're gonna have a look at that in later volumes. Now, while Moon Cradle is technically a single story separated into two, the tone of the two books are significantly different from each other. While volume 20 fits in with the feeling of, every other Sword Art Online light novel we have, volume 19 feels a lot more dated in its narrative presentation, much more clumsy in comparison. As if, these two stories were written in completely different times, decades even. And that's kinda because they were. You see, Sword Art Online was written as a web novel before it was picked up by Dengeki to become an officially published light novel. The overall plot was relatively the same, but the tone and narrative style had significant differences, as Reki pretty much overhauled his entire story that was present from Incarnate to the end of Alicization when bringing it up to the standards of the light novels that we know today. There were also a lot of self-published side stories that were incorporated into the main series, either through getting re-self-published by Reki in different ways or being written into the main series novels or publications. Moon Cradle is one of the latter. Partially. Most of Volume 19's contents had already existed, much like a lot of other stories prior to the light novelization of the series. Generally, since stories are overhauled in their entirety, there is not a discrepancy to talk about across every single volume. While the stories themselves are not rewritten per se, they receive the same approach uniformly when being updated. In comparison, Moon Cradle did not have the benefit of this uniform approach, at least to the same extent the other light novels were. Part of its content were to be overhauled, while part of it was basically written as brand new content, a larger portion of it in fact. All the while, Reki Kawahara was also tasked with the future of SAO, namely the next main arc, United Ring, as well as the companion series going back to Incarnate, SAO Progressive. Needless to say, he also has Axel World and the Isolator to tend to, all in all, a large-scale, almost completely isolated side story like Moon Cradle was likely not on his list of priorities. What I imagined happened here is that he simply did not want to spend too much time overhauling the already existing Moon Cradle narrative in this case, as the already written portion of Moon Cradle was about 3-4 times the size of a typical side story, he writes, and the result was the highly inconsistent tonal approach that we faced in the first half of Moon Cradle in Volume 19. Now, I know it's not exactly the best idea to talk about these kinds of stuff before I even extensively talk about what's actually going on in the books themselves, which is why I did not particularly attach a personal feeling, just provided you the grounds of what I'm about to talk about, because you'll also see my opinion about the story change over time as we leave these dated portions of Volume 19 and move over to Volume 20 content. So how about we head into the actual story now? Much like many other side stories, our protagonist throughout the majority of Moon Cradle is not Kirito himself, but Ronye Arabelle. 1.5 years have passed since the defeat of the Dark God Vecta, and peace has been made between the Human Empire and the Dark Territory. After the war, as the most powerful of the remaining Dark Territory generals, Iskahn of the Pugilists Guild took the role of the ruler of the Dark Territory, with Scheta the Silent remaining by his side as an ambassador of the Human Empire. Meanwhile, in the Human Empire, the Axiom Church was practically abolished and replaced with the Human Unification Council tasked with bringing peace across Underworld. While the Integrity Knights led by Fanatio generally call the shots there, it is a much more inclusive scene based on different perspectives and opinions, where Kirito and Asuna also take part in as council delegates. A lot of the realities about the Axiom Church and Quinella were not shared with the populace. However, this transition was quite troublesome, as the new system also went away with the feudal caste system of the Human Empire, which obviously did not go well with the 4 emperors of the 4 quadrants. As a result, a massive rebellion took place, with the armies of the emperors claiming the council was attempting to usurp the pontifex herself. Well, they're not particularly wrong on that claim, and that they were fighting in the name of the pontifex herself, which allowed them to wage war against the Integrity Knights, as they interpreted the Unification Council as a threat to the Axiom Church itself that they were bound to. The rebellion was quelled in the end, the armies of the emperors defeated, 3 out of 4 emperors confirmed dead, while the 4th one's residence was basically evaporated into oblivion by Fanatio's heaven-piercing blade while he was in it. With no more authority figure left to attempt rebellion, Human Empire and the Dark Territory established peace treaties, allowed trade to open up between the nations, and accept tourists from the other side in an attempt to establish a cultural exchange for both sides to welcome each other. Rules issued by the Human Unification Council and the Law of Power ensuring the Dark Territory residents would not be able to disobey Iskahn dictated that the peace would not be broken even if there was bad blood between the residents. And hopefully, as time heals the recent wounds and the cultural exchange showing different perspectives to both sides, it would eventually lead to the 2 nations and half a dozen races living in harmony. It's a very well set foundation for the story to come, with a lot of the lore that's vaguely hinted at and even directly tied into some of the very interesting events in the story. And Moon Cradle begins with a festival held by the council that is used as a showcase for the new invention, a Dragoncraft Prototype that uses thermal elements for propulsion while utilizing cryogenic elements at the same time to ensure the internal parts do not give in to the generated heat. Well, it does seem like quite the advanced engineering feat from the outside. The explanations, despite being from Ronye, an Underworlder's perspective, convey how easily you can cheat actual engineering when you have an extensive magic system at your disposal. But as the dork he is, Kirito fails the prototype test spectacularly and gets reprimanded by Düsselbert and Fanatio for almost causing a 9/11 with the Central Cathedral. But as with most things, there was a reason Kirito wanted to build Dragoncraft, as he later explains to Ronye, and I'll spare you the extensive details because it will tie into the end of Alicization, etc, etc. Moon Cradle is filled with incredible amounts of world building and system information regarding Underworld, so it's basically worth reading it solely for those alone. But the gist of it is, Kirito wants to solve the habitable space problem of the Dark Territory, where a majority of the soil there is completely incapable of being cultivated into farmable lands, as the underlying design of Wrath was to push the Dark Territory to a point where they would want to invade the rich soil of the human empire. It was by design. And as long as the desolate land existed, the Dark Territory would look at the human empire lands with envy. But land in Underworld was limited, and the edges of the place were surrounded by an impassable wall so high that you couldn't go over it. Kirito imagined there would be more land on the other side of the wall, and thus tried to fly high enough to look beyond, but was stopped by the same kind of altitude limiter mechanism existing in Halo, preventing him from ever going beyond. But he also realized that when he threw an object, it would surpass the limiter the same way the limiter in Halo could be cheated at times. So he figured rather than attempting to fly over it himself, he would create a Dragoncraft that would allow him to travel inside of rather than flying himself. But those plans had to be delayed as bad news had just arrived. A human had been murdered, seemingly in the hands of a Dark Territory goblin at an inn. A massive investigation begins at this point, including the Integrity Knights chiming in to assess the situation. All the while, there are also some calmer moments that give you much more depth to the world and characters. For example, Ronye and Tiese talking about Renly's proposal to Tiese and how much she hurts inside, unable to move on from Yujio's passing, a topic that is criminally underused throughout the story due to not directly being relevant to the main story at hand, which is kind of a shame if you ask me. But going back to the said main story, Kirito is quite convinced that the goblin was being framed for the murder of a human in an attempt to cause unrest between the two nations, one of the biggest evidences being that the weapon of the crime completely dissolving on its own, indicating it was not a goblin weapon, but a sacred arts generated tool instead, ruling out the fact that a mere goblin could ever achieve such a feat. But the real problem in this case is not even who did it, but rather how anyone even managed to do it in the first place. It really elevates a mundane murder mystery to a completely different level and raises the stakes immensely. It's not a random murder case here, but rather the existence of someone seemingly not bound by the taboo index or by the law of power, both equally scary implications for Underworlders. But to ensure the latter holds true, as well as to preemptively prevent a potential crisis, Kirito decides to travel to the Dark Territory to discuss the circumstances with Iskahn. During this time, Ronye is tasked with accompanying Kirito on this journey, and Asuna takes her to the armory to graduate her from her Integrity Knight trainee sword into a proper weapon. And we learn a lot of the details about the world too, as well as a showcase of how Ronye has grown over the time since they first met Kirito and Yujio at the Swordcraft Academy. She remembers how Kirito talked about hidden parameters of weapons that are not visible on the Stacia window, even besides the abilities of divine weapons, something you'll recognize as hidden perks from traditional games we have today, and how Yujio talked about his times with the Blue Rose sword, about the connection they shared. Following the advice of Yujio, how the affection between the weapon and its user allows them to reach their full potential, Ronye picks a sword from the selection Asuna offers without a doubt, however postpones naming it much like Kirito did with the black one. Shortly afterwards, the duo board the second Dragoncraft Prototype and head out to the Obsidia Palace, reducing a multiple days long journey into just a couple hours. They spend the night at the city in their disguises to not attract any unwanted attention to their real identities from the human empire, while experiencing a lot of kindness from the Darklanders, something that deeply affects Ronye and her perception as to why such a divide even exists in the first place, something she continuously grapples with in her mind. At this point, the book really becomes a great exploration of the underworld in general. We encounter and meet so many different people, learn how the world is healing and progressing after the war, what issues these people are having in their daily lives, and how the two nations compare against each other in terms of resources. For example, while the human empire has, yes, more fertile lands, the Dark Territory has a huge industry based on mining and materials, which is one of the foundations of the newfound trade relationship between both regions. The next day, with the genius that is Kirito there, they get into the Obsidia Palace in the stupidest way imaginable by sensing the window that belongs to Scheta and throwing stuff at it to get her attention. Once inside, they meet Lisetta, Iskahn and Scheta's newborn, and have a chat with Iskahn regarding the situation, who is equally terrified by the circumstances. However, before too long, they are shaken by the fact that Lisetta has been abducted by a mysterious hooded person, threatening to take her life unless Iskahn executes Kirito. While the man in the hooded figure tries to gain time to run away without being seen by distracting everyone with minions in some random area of the Obsidia Palace, the group quickly reaches to the conclusion that the only room in the entire building they have not searched yet was the Imperial Throne Room belonging to Emperor Vecta, and that had been magically sealed with large chains upon his ejection from the world, the same way it was before his arrival. While the lock was in fact indestructible, since we're playing by the War of Underworld rules at this point, there's nothing a little bit of incarnation cannot solve, so Kirito just destroys the lock and opens the door. Although Scheta, being confident that she would be able to cut through if she still had the Black Lily sword, was a nice moment that I would have loved to see in action. Once inside, they find the hooded man holding Lisetta hostage. To prevent him from killing her on the spot, Kirito conjures an incarnate shield around the baby blocking the knife and orders Iskahn and Scheta to take the offensive as he keeps maintaining that shield, which is something people didn't realize when watching the clip that Unleashed Blading published from that scene. You know, Kirito was not exactly doing absolutely nothing there. Iskahn takes out the minion and tanks its acid blood for Scheta to lunge forward and cut the arm of the hooded man that was holding the knife clean with her bare hands, but before she could go for a second attack, gets hit by a paralyzing needle. The man uses a red crystal pendant to open up a special window to run out of, but in a last-ditch attempt, Ronye puts all her will into the Aincrad-style attack, Sonic Leap, and manages to cut the other arm holding Lisetta and secures her as the hooded figure disappears through the mysterious window. With the climax coming to a close, Volume 19 comes to a conclusion as well, with Ronye wondering what the ultimate purpose of these two nations always being on each other's throat is, despite speaking the same language and looking at the same moon every night, as she names her weapon the Moonbeam Sword. It's quite a nice story, not much is technically happening throughout, it's quite a long story, as a large portion of the book feels like a recap and a reference throwing fest to all the events you experienced during the Alicization arc, but the mystery it sets up with the murder mystery is genuinely an interesting one, and it is built up with a lot of care as well, if you ask me. All the intricate details going into the making the mystery unique to Underworld also allows you to learn a lot more about the world itself and its mechanics, and while I do not enjoy the incarnation shenanigans myself, there's so much to chew regarding the usual mechanics of the world too. And while I only covered the basic plot outline of Volume 19, we'll go into Volume 20 shortly after, there are also a lot of teased plots as well that are not necessarily part of Moon Cradle in general. How the new Human Unification Council functions, Fanatuyan Berkulissan Bershe, the relations between different races of the Dark Territory as well as the Human Empire, and how the treaties shape these cultures going forward. But most importantly, from my perspective, Tiese's feelings were a highlight of the volume despite not being covered enough. The way she's struggling with the past memories of Yu-Gi-Oh, unable to move on despite Renly's best efforts to help her, similar to how Kirito cannot move on from the loss of Yu-Gi-Oh either. And you know, before I address the elephant in the room with Volume 19, I want to focus on that. A lot of people believe it was a massive missed opportunity that the story of Moon Cradle has Ronye as its protagonist rather than Tiese. And it's a notion I 100% agree with, at least on the topic of Volume 19. The trip to the Dark Territory, it allows some very nice personal moments between the characters, yes, but I cannot shake off the feeling that these moments could have been much better utilized if they were taking place between Kirito and Tiese rather than Kirito and Ronye. Why do I believe that? Because that exact scenario was what made the Phantom Bullet arc so good, what made the dynamic between Shinon and Kirito so engaging. They both shared a common source of grief or regret that they were both so carefully hiding from each other, but eventually they had to get real and face it all together. We have the golden opportunity here where both Kirito and Tiese feel devastated by the loss of Yu-Gi-Oh. Both of them cannot move on. Both of them blame themselves for his death. Tiese blames herself for asking Yujiro to protect her, to marry her, and in the end, the fact that it was her rash behavior towards Humbert and Rayos that put them in a position to be saved by Yujiro, which took him on his path to death. Kirito, on the other hand, blames himself for not being the one to die instead of Yujiro, for using him since the beginning to find an admin console that eventually led to his death, how Yujiro's memory fragment gave its last shine to protect him from Gabrielle Miller. I would have taken a heartfelt talk between the two over any Kirito and Ronye moment in the story, and I just can't believe that we will likely never have it. Well, except if something happens in United Ring, but not gonna go there in this video. But either way, while I do have basic gripes and perceived missed opportunities, based on the way I summarized the first half of Moon Cradle, probably has to go, well, why did you open up with such a bleak picture about the narrative then? Okay, well, just visualize that 3 pages of brief summary full of moments and scenes, and to every single paragraph add a sentence or two about how hopeless Ronye feels about having a crush on Kirito and how she wants to kill herself because she'll never get a chance. Yeah, that's what we're dealing with here. For a majority of volume 19, every 5 pages or so, the plot will be coming to a complete halt as you listen to Ronye ramble about her feelings on Kirito for a bit. And that is what I refer to as a relic of the past at the beginning of this video. The story generally being much more edgy and there being more feelings thrown around, etc. back in the web novel days. Sometimes you'll get that odd, it was the author's original vision kind of web novel people come knocking on your Twitter, not realizing how many people actually despise their earlier creations. They never think about why the author decided to change the story when it was published as a light novel. Well, this is why, because if you halt your story every 5 pages for your teenage protagonist to lust over your main protagonist who has his fate sealed with her lifelong partner that everyone is rooting for, maybe, just maybe, that is not the best idea. That was sarcasm, by the way. There is no maybe to talk about. It just reads terrible all around to pull you out of the ongoing story to go into La La Land for a couple paragraphs for no reason whatsoever. In the end, we get an intriguing plot being built up with the worst presentation I have ever seen in an SAO novel so far, which honestly is a massive shame. Luckily, the second half of the story kinda sorta picks up the slack. Well, as much as it can without doing a complete 180, that is. The second half of Moon Cradle's story is also primarily told from Ronye's perspective. However, there are some minor bits that are from Asuna's point of view and the highlight of the entire story from a third, totally different perspective that we'll get to. The book begins with a great flashback/nightmare sequence, the amazing intensity and weight you get from all the action moments in Sword Art Online, instantly telling you, yo, dude, trust me, this isn't volume 19. Just a year ago, Ronye was standing in front of the cold and intimidating Cruiga Norlangarth, the emperor of the Norlangarth North Empire, inside the Northern Imperial Palace, leading his troops during the rebellion of the Four Empires against the Human Unification Council. While Tiese and Ronye had managed to take down the emperor that day with their combination attacks, Ronye still woke up from her nightmare with cold sweat. The murder mystery remained unsolved, and whoever had set it in motion knew Kirito would head to the Obsidia Palace and had already prepared to have him executed by Iskahn. They were now safely back in the Central Cathedral with Kirito, but were no closer to revealing the mystery itself. And despite the intense opening to the second half of the story, the first half of the book passes by in quite a chill way. Not just in a rambling about possibilities way either. We get to hear and learn about the daily lives of a lot of characters, other characters we have never seen in the Central Cathedral before, including 2 Integrity Knights who were tasked with patrolling the End Mountains and protecting the Central Cathedral during the War of Underworld, Nargius Synthesis 16 and Entokia Synthesis 18. They are interesting characters, but either due to the incomplete nature of the Moon Cradle story or due to some other reason, these 2 particularly feel like they were injected into the story just for the sake of it. It doesn't feel out of place or anything. In fact, in normal cases, I'd likely just take it as natural that these 2 are also present in a meeting that all Integrity Knights currently at the premises are called to, but the amount of backstory they receive, along with their feelings being portrayed with quite the spotlight and passion, It makes me feel like they were in the plans for something bigger in the story, but the story itself was cut short before any of that could transpire. It's quite the weird thing, to be honest. Like, the amount of effort that was put into establishing them for seemingly no reason, that is an interesting thing to do. That makes me think the way I think, that they would have a role somewhere in Moon Cradle, but the story was simply cut earlier than when they would appear. But let's go back. When I say chill though, it's not that the plot itself is not progressing. Kirito, Asuna, Ronye and Tiese continue the investigation. We get a cool new way of using sacred arts by tapping into the system logs, where Asuna has a brief look back at the exact incident, proving that the goblin was simply framed for the kill. We also get some insight on the kill itself, although it does not feel like it matches up with the established rules on judicial authority of high nobles and how it interacts with the taboo index, but I'll spare you the explainer here. The gist of it is, the person who committed the murder was able to do so by exploiting his judicial authority stemming from the Norlangarth Emperor's private estate. But the reason I call the progression of the story chill is because you never feel an urgency. No matter how many times the characters say this may just grow into a full-scale War of Underworld 2 electric boogaloo, so much so that mystery solving, especially since we're experiencing from the perspective of Ronye rather than Kirito, it just feels like, you know, the feeling of things randomly falling into their place if you just wait long enough without doing anything significant. And the event at hand should not be one of those things. It's War of Underworld 2. It's a massive disaster scenario that is seemingly getting solved by sheer luck in every corner. Granted, that's mostly caused by the fact that Kirito never shares the stupid plans he has in his head and acts in that "don't worry, everything is alright" mood, but again, the complaint towards how the narrative is presented remains, because that is effectively what we're reading as the reader. Like, I'm absolutely sure Kirito has some utterly stupid, complex gamble plan for solving the entire issue, but my assumption is not what's in the book to judge. Anyways, in the end, they take a break from investigating, and Ronye and Tiese and their little dragons go to the lakeside, near the old residence of the Norlangarth family residence. And that is when the intensity from the first pages of the book start coming back beautifully, and things start getting really interesting as Ronye and Tiese start investigating the weirdness inside the Imperial grounds, where they are eventually trapped by a hooded man in the dungeon below who reveals himself to be Emperor Cruiga Norlangarth, who was assumed to be dead. And dead he was, however, he was basically remade as a minion with dark arts from clay by utilizing an Imperial heirloom to use as a catalyst. Without going too deep, think of it as a cheap imitation of who Cruiga was rather than the real person. Without the heirloom, they cannot be brought back even as minions, as Cruiga reveals the person responsible for the events at the Obsidia Palace back in Volume 19 was the Emperor of the Eastern Empire, Hozaika Istavariev, whose heirloom was destroyed during his escape attempt, which was why he was never found. He just disappeared into dust. And these moments down in the dungeon, they're great too. It showcases a lot of character for both Ronye and Tiese as they try to resist but end up having to yield to save one of their dragons, as well as the three goblins in the next cell, the group that was set up for the murder at the beginning of the story. I glossed over a bunch of stuff, the summary is long enough as is. However, the other dragon, Tsukigake, who had successfully managed to hide away, remains safe and is sent out to seek help. And while Ronye and Tiese continue to have very strong moments showcasing their growth and ingenuity they learned from their upperclassmen, Tsukigake absolutely steals the entire book in my opinion, with an entire chapter dedicated to his great escape. It's the kind of stuff that made me love Zakaria chapter back in Alicization running, to see the world from a completely different perspective thanks to the mysterious observer that was later revealed to be Sharlock the Spider, and here we followed Tsukigake going through numerous different environments and dangers, finding a partner in crime, the Rat Natsu, protecting her new partner with her remaining life in the direst of situations, and eventually managing to get the attention of Kirito and Asuna, who were flying right above for a last-second rescue. Honestly, this chapter is so full of information regarding how the world works, yet feels so tense and urgent, unlike the entirety of Moon Cradle in general is. It's absolutely great, and I can wholeheartedly say it's one of the couple saving graces of Moon Cradle in general. That is not to say Tiese and Ronye having a last stand against Cruiga is any worse though. As I said, the final stretch of Volume 20 has all that intensity that Moon Cradle so desperately lacked and needed given its premise. Ronye and Tiese fighting perfectly in sync, even pulling off sacred arts as a duo thanks to their close bond. It's a massive highlight. And while you may not know the significance of this because the Alicization anime did not highlight the tidbit clearly at all, but Tiese becomes one of the rare people who actually end up triggering the seal of the right eye, as Cruiga uses some dark arts to turn the goblins into monsters to fight Ronye and Tiese. Underworlders rarely even think about breaking the rules, so only a handful of people even know about the seal of the right eye to begin with. Berkuli and Miss Azurika tease their knowledge of it back in Alicization. Yujo, Alice, Lilpilin and Iskahn obviously know about it, but knowing the monsters are innocent goblins in this case she is not allowed to kill, Tiese just succumbs to the pain of Error 871 and gets smacked just the same as she was trying to protect Ronye. The entire sequence is quite heartbreaking to follow, as they seemingly had established control of the situation very well, but bit by bit they continued to lose ground and eventually found themselves at a complete loss. But like in many other cases that Kirito had endured, memories have huge power in Underworld. Remember that time at the very end of the Human Realm sub-arc where Alice just jumped in front of a completely given up Kirito to save him from that final slash from Quinella? How Kirito had a flashback of Asuna doing the same back from Aincrad. And then he had a vision of Cardinal where she reminded him of things he was supposed to know already. The same way, Ronye hears the voice of Yujo from the depths of her memory along with the moonbeam sword in her hands telling her to unleash her. It's a great moment that leads to a lot of confusion, understandably so, and maybe I'll eventually do an explained video on that, as Ronye manages to activate the perfect weapon control of the non-divine moonbeam sword to blind everyone in the room in an attempt to make an escape with Tiese. Sadly, or maybe luckily given the circumstances that they wouldn't be able to run away, she doesn't get a satisfying conclusion to her efforts though, as Kirito and Asuna arrive on the scene in quite the epic fashion to take out minion Cruiga with relative ease. However, the main teaser for a continuation lands right here, as the red jewel Cruiga was wearing around his neck, the same jewel Hozaika had used to open the portal in the Obsidia Palace, suddenly flings into the air and starts flying over to the west, obviously hinting at the only non-confirmed dead Emperor Alderez of the Westeroth Empire that Art Online Unleashed Blading certainly did not get the memo of and acted like Cruiga was the big bad or something, especially with that opening really overplaying things. Do tell me, did you follow the Moon Cradle adaptation in Unleashed Blading? Either way, the final third of Moon Cradle Volume 20 easily challenges any of the climaxes of the series, and it's definitely worth it despite how much most of the story ends up leaving a lot to be desired due to lack of clear focus in the narrative. I definitely don't think Ronye was a good main character to follow the story from the perspective of in general. However, that was clearly not entirely the fault of the character, but rather the different style of the web novel days. But I also still believe having Tiese as the main character would have allowed a much needed closure for both her and Kirito. You see, the main issue with Ronye is that even beyond her Volume 19 strong crush towards Kirito, she just does not really have a lot to talk about with Kirito, not a lot that we know at least. It's the usual senpai-kohai relationship they got going, which doesn't exactly contribute anything special for their characters. On the other hand, both Tiese and Kirito suffer greatly from the passing of Yujio. I do believe we could have gotten an emotional payoff as strong as, if not stronger, as Kirito's time with Shinon back in Phantom Bullet with this one. And it's a shame we never got that. And one of the other main problems of Moon Cradle, you see, we have a really nice epilogue-like scene after the events of the Norlangarth Villa, Kirito, Asuna, Tiese and Ronye on the Central Cathedral. As if the red jewel flying off into the Western Empire was not a huge cliffhanger enough, the final scene teases the knighting of Tiese and Ronye, we don't actually get to see it in the book, goes deeper into the Yu-Gi-Oh situation, brings in Selka as well as Frenica into the Central Cathedral, we don't get to see them either, continue hinting at all the potentials about the Black Emperor's situation. There's just so much that is unresolved, or rather set for an obvious continuation, let's say. And then Reki just continues to talk more about it in his afterword as to how the Black Emperor's story remains unsolved for the next 200 years and ties into the ambush of the abyssal horror at the end of volume 18, Alicization Lasting. And those of you who have United Ring knowledge are aware that will likely tie stuff in there really soon. And I'm not even talking about stuff that is in the story that was obviously put there for more in mind, Entoki and Nergius both, but nothing came to fruition because a lid had to be pulled over the story before anything could be done with them. All in all, it's just incomplete. And now that we are deep into United Ring, we likely won't have a conclusion to things that could have been addressed with another short volume before United Ring began, that is. United Ring will surely tie in the 200-year-old struggle, but anything specific to the loose ends of Moon Cradle, they feel like they have now been lost to time. That's pretty much all I have to say on Moon Cradle, both volume 19 and volume 20, with a relatively extensive summary attached as well. In the future, I am not sure whether I should have such an extensive summary or not. I feel like going into specifics and tying my review into those specific examples throughout the summary kinda fits well, but it's also kind of causing the video to be much longer than I prefer it to be. So please do share your thoughts about what you would prefer personally. Shorter summary and more generalized review, or even more extensive and detailed of a summary and opinions tied to the very specific specifics. Is that even a review at that point? Would you be interested in summaries as a standalone thing? I don't know. You know, just tell me anything that comes to your mind. I'll shape these book club videos accordingly. Thank you very much for watching. Huge shout out to Now from SAO Wikia. The colored versions of black and white illustrations from the light novels are all his doing, so go show him some love on Twitter. If you want to get the books, Amazon and Book Depository links will be in the description as well, so do check them out if you're interested. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, comment. Huge thanks to patrons and channel members. As always, if my channel has been remonetized to have members, I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, stay cool.